There's something special about the first Resident Evil game. Just like other franchise first, there's a lot of cool and unique stuff, and that's not even to mention the fact that it basically kickstarted an entire genre all on its own with survival horror. And I know that we should technically credit Sweet Home and Alone in the Dark first, but okay, there you go. I lied. They did it first. Resident Evil riffs on the typical B-movie horror films and TV shows you'd normally see late at night on a weird channel like Spooky TV or something like that. The kind of productions that work on a shoestring budget but make up for that cheapness with pure soul and cheesiness. Resident Evil has both of these in spades, and even though it's distinctly rough around the edges now, it's hard for me to look at the game and not be in love with its charm. There's a fine line in horror games between creating an experience that's scary and immersive, or fun and cozy, and Resident Evil manages to juggle both by offering moments that are a little creepy alongside a tone that is clearly having fun with itself. Now, whether that sort of tone is intentional in all areas is up for debate, but from my perspective, that's what makes this first game an entry that every RE fan needs to play.
You were almost a Jill sandwich.
You're right.
It's aware that it's not trying to be the scariest game in town, and it knows where it can have a little bit of fun. Wrap that up in a package featuring hilariously goofy death traps, or a villain that's the best kind of stereotypically evil guy, and we've got something real goofy and fun here. None of this is to discount what makes Resident Evil so special though. Take a look past the horror and story, and we've got a game with a ton of complex mechanics that amazingly manage to work pretty well. If we were to compare genres, Resident Evil is like a really slow-paced Metroidvania, with paths that intersect across its map and opportunities for backtracking to gain some useful items. The divergence starts with the emphasis on item management, plus the fact that Jill never gets a double jump, but knowing this franchise, that could come any day now. If you think about the balancing act needed to keep a game like Resident Evil fun and fair, it seems like a pretty tough job. You have to balance the game around having limited resources, but items can't be so limited to the point where most players run out of ammo and health items halfway through exploring the mansion and right before a boss fight. You also need to put in the exact right amount of enemies so that players don't feel the need to waste their precious ammo before a boss fight too. And this isn't like most modern survival horror games where you'll probably find a fair bit of health and ammo inside the boss arena. You need to make do with whatever is in your inventory the second you walk through that door. Astonishingly, Capcom managed to get the balance almost perfect in Resident Evil, to the point where I didn't feel constrained at all by game design I assumed would be far more punishing than it ended up being. This makes the game a really easy entry to go back and play if you're already familiar with the series, and you don't really mind all the rust that's on show, which is not often the case for initial titles in long-running franchises. And I feel like it's rare to play through a game that's this smooth in this situation, but hey, I do have a soft spot for 3D PlayStation games, so that's probably why I like it so much. But that's enough of an intro. Let's talk about Resident Evil, which we've already been doing for about 3 minutes. Resident Evil's core concept is about as basic as you'd expect any B-horror movie to be. The game is set in the Arklay Mountains near the fictional Raccoon City. A bunch of murders have taken place in the city, and the Special Tactics and Rescue Service Division, also known as STARS, of the Raccoon City Police Department is sent out to investigate. STARS is split up into an Alpha and a Bravo team, but Bravo team recently went missing up in the mountains, and that leaves us controlling 2 members of Alpha team while they try and figure out what happened. Things don't go very well, and after finding the remains of another of their teams, Chris Redfield, Jill Valentine, Barry Burton, and Albert Wesker find themselves in a big, weird, spooky mansion. This intro is arguably the most iconic one from any survival horror game, and I have to admit how disappointed I am that this didn't become a tradition of Resident Evil moving forward. The idea of making a full-on live-action B-movie horror opening to your game is incredible. It also manages to feel a little spooky, with the black and white obscuring a lot of detail that would make certain moments feel easier to visually read. I also love the complete lack of music for this entire opening sequence, with only the sounds of the scene carrying through. It's effective, and more importantly, immediately contrasted by the badass introductions for each of our main characters, complete with a cool rock track and plenty of fire-based transitions.
Jill Valentine, Barry Burton, Rebecca Chambers, Albert Wesker, Resident Evil.
Again, Resident Evil thrives on its tonal shifts. One moment it convinces you that it's the hardest horror game you've ever played, and the next it introduces a cast of badass characters that each look like they could probably wrestle a bear and absolutely die trying. From this moment on, you take the reins of your choice of character, and immediately we got some differences to talk about. If you choose to play as Chris Redfield, then Barry won't be inside the mansion with you, and Chris will have to go off and explore the first part of the mansion all by himself. And when he comes back into the main hall, Wesker and Jill will be gone as well. But if you decide to play as Jill, it's Chris who's disappeared this time, with Barry acting as your partner for the first few areas and giving you advice on where to go and what to do. Barry is part of why the game considers Jill's route easier, since he gives you a nudge in the right direction every so often, at least in this early portion of the mansion anyway. For the most part in Jill's scenario, you still have to suss out where you need to go on your own, but Barry is there to acclimate you to the loop for the first hour or so. On the gameplay side of things, Resident Evil is unsurprisingly still a lot of fun. The classic trademark gameplay is in full force here. You get given a sprawling location with dozens of rooms and corridors to explore, and you'll need to carefully manage your resources if you want to survive. Since this is the very first game in a long-running series, you might expect there to be some major missing element. Like maybe this game doesn't have storage boxes or something. But nope, everything that makes this series tick is here from the get-go. It would be absolutely insane if some game in the future decided to strip away a key mechanic for some reason. That would be weird and bad. It feels genuinely bizarre to me to play the first entry of a series like this and not feel like anything is missing or out of place. Somehow Capcom managed to get it right on the very first swing. But for the sake of those who may not be completely familiar with classic Resident Evil, let me quickly break down the general gameplay and what you should expect. In this game's case, your job is to explore the Spencer Mansion and its surrounding areas while fighting zombies and mutated creatures that roam the halls. All the while, you'll be managing your ammo and healing items to fend off attacks from enemies that want your flesh. Sometimes you'll solve puzzles, other times you'll partake in boss fights, but most of the runtime is dedicated to basic exploration to find items that will lead you towards progression. For the first time through though, you'll likely be finding yourself getting lost quite a bit, and you may even find yourself completely stuck thinking that you've searched everywhere you possibly could. This is just a survival horror staple at the end of the day, and half the fun in these games is trying to put the pieces together to figure out where progression eventually leads. Resident Evil thankfully isn't all that complicated about where to go and what to do. For the most part it feels pretty straightforward, though there are times when I got lost on my first playthrough too. The initial search around the mansion to find the 4 crests to open up the residences took a little while on my first go around, since I was trying to remember where I hadn't gone yet, all the while trying to figure out what these 4 crests were even for. Of course, once you've been through it once, you'll know what to do every other time you come back for a replay. This is why the 2 scenarios work together so well. No matter who you decide to play through the game as first, either playthrough will inform the second, and so on. And it'll allow you to blow through the game twice as fast as you did before. Resident Evil is a smooth ride for sure, but I can't look past some of the jank that is present. None of which is something I necessarily hold against the game, for the record. Most of my complaints are due to Resident Evil being one of the first mainstream 3D games. It came out in 1996 before some of the heavy hitters of the era like Ocarina of Time, Metal Gear Solid, or even Final Fantasy VII came around. But because of that, there are a couple of things here that might put you off if you aren't used to them. First and foremost, we have to of course talk about the tank controls. And for the record, I love tank controls. I think they are one of the best movement systems that we have ever created for 3D games. And if you don't agree, grow up. That felt a bit harsh, but it's true. Tank controls are not an issue, but other areas of movement tend to pose a problem sometimes. For example, you can't walk upstairs by simply pushing your character up them. You need to interact with them like how you'd open a door, and that locks you into climbing the stairs in one single motion without being able to move around at all. So if there's a situation where a zombie would be best dispatched up a couple steps, sorry, you don't get that option. In fairness, this doesn't really come up frequently at all, so don't worry about it too much. It's more of an example of how things aren't completely refined just yet. The other infamous mechanic that makes this game feel a little more punishing is Resident Evil's saving system. You can only save the game by using typewriters dotted throughout the game in certain rooms, but saving uses up an ink ribbon, of which there is a finite amount. So saving becomes a whole mechanic in itself, where you have to weigh the benefits of saving your game at a certain time. If you're trigger happy with your saves, you may not have an increment to save the game at a pivotal moment before a boss fight. And if you're a little too sparing with your saves, you may end up losing a ton of progress because you didn't save the game for 3 hours and you were just decapitated by a hunter. The limited save count isn't mandatory to create tension in a game like this, but it contextualizes how important keeping an eye on resources and making steady progress actually is. And it adds more meaning to actions that could be deemed as risky, like exploring the mansion without recovery items or forgetting to pack a shotgun for annoying zombies that get in the way. It ultimately adds more meaning to everything you do. It helps to make the game feel a little less mundane when you do simple actions like walking through a corridor while praying that no hunters are waiting around the corner this time. Another old school trait, although this is kind of more of a general survival horror thing, is that Resident Evil doesn't outright tell you how to progress. Either way, it's easy to imagine a lot of players being stumped and stuck in a save room while they stare at the map trying to figure out where to go next after a lot of trial and error has led nowhere. This could be read as boring or dull game design at certain points, but it's perhaps the moment when you're actually the most engaged with what the game is doing. Using a memory to try to figure out what you have and haven't done, while also doing the mental gymnastics of balancing resources, is central to classic RE's core loop. Most of the time, Resident Evil will not give you all the information you need to just go where progression demands. It's more than happy to give you part of the solution and let you figure out the rest. This gives the player a lot more agency in certain moments, since anywhere you decide to go in the game is dependent on what you decide to do with the information that you have. Everything you do is guided by what you currently know, and when the eventual light bulb moment happens, it's immensely satisfying to figure out where to go and what to do. At a certain point in a future playthrough, you'll likely be able to remember where everything is based purely on instinct. And when you do know where basically everything is, this is no longer a game about discovery or exploration. It all becomes about optimization. This can be in the form of full-blown speedrunning or more low-key moment-to-moment decisions you make. If you find yourself running low on health or ammo, for example, then you'll most likely want to access your stash in a save room. And as your knowledge of the map grows, you can easily plot out routes that you know will be more effective. And executing on this knowledge consistently yields some incredibly satisfying moments. Situations like these are some of the tensest that Resident Evil has to offer, but if you manage to make it back, nothing beats being greeted by that music. And this music is something you'll hear a lot, since you'll constantly be heading back to a save room throughout the game. Both Jill and Chris have a limited amount of inventory space, with Jill having 8 slots to use up and Chris having 6. And I'll just say that Chris's playthrough is a miserable experience because of this. On a second playthrough, it's not so bad since you already know the value of some items and which ones you need to take with you. But for the first time through, you will constantly have to run back to the save room to dump everything you have. So my advice would always be to start with Jill, since her playthrough is so much nicer in comparison. From a visual standpoint, the mansion looks ripped straight out of a set from a TV show, where they send in contestants to solve funny puzzles before getting crushed to death as part of a funny prank. The main hall in particular straddles the line between being impressive from a visual standpoint, but also oddly plain. For an expensive mansion in the mountains, you'd expect there to be some extravagant paintings or neat pottery or whatever else rich people have to plug up that hole in their souls. Instead, we've got plain walls and rooms with lighting that range from stark white to so dim that it's time someone changed the bulbs. Good luck doing that with this place taking most of its core design cues from the Looney Tunes though. Other areas in the game lack the visual recognition that some of the core areas of the mansion have for obvious reasons. Besides the main estate, you've got the residence in the back that looks more like an abandoned shack, which I suppose is literally what it is in this game. You've then got the underground tunnels, which frankly do not look good, and then there are the 2 labs you get to explore later on. So there's plenty of variety in terms of what you get to explore, and the game does a good job of keeping things paced well. But when things aren't so chill, you'll need to defend yourself. Combat isn't all that complex in Resident Evil. You simply ready your weapon with the ready stance button, and then shoot it with the fire button. There isn't much mechanical complexity there, but there is still some nuance to discuss. In the ready stance, you can look up and down to target your attacks in those directions instead of just straight ahead. This is helpful in situations when a zombie is at your feet, or a similarly dire situation where you need to knife a bee. Resident Evil also has an auto-targeting system that reorients your direction to wherever the enemy you're attacking is. This is vital for moments where an enemy is off-screen and you can't make out where they are exactly. Hilariously, the original North American and European versions had auto-targeting removed, so don't play those ones. The act of using a weapon is not complicated or particularly dense mechanically, but even then, that's not really a problem because combat is really all about resource management. And most of the time, the decision to even engage in combat is more important than the encounters themselves. A single shotgun shell is a valuable commodity in Resident Evil, and the decision of whether to use it or not is a big one to make. Luckily, ammo isn't all that rare, so using ammo on random zombies in a corridor won't make the game impossible to beat or anything. It's more so the thought of potentially wasting ammo that tends to make everything feel more stressful. But as soon as you realize that tension is pretty much fake, the game gets a lot bloodier. Each weapon also has traits that suit them towards specific situations. The handgun is the standard damage dealer that can reach zombies down long corridors. The trade-off is that it deals low damage and usually takes a zombie down in about 5 to 6 shots. So in up-close engagements, it's not a good idea to use it to take down a group of enemies, but since ammo for it is extremely common, it's something you'll probably have in your inventory throughout the entire game. In contrast, the shotgun makes short work of crowds, and it's where things literally get juicy. Then there's the Magnum, which combines the range of the pistol with the power of the shotgun to make a gun that's perfect in every way, but has very few ammo drops throughout the game. Then there are the two special weapons that are specific to Jill and Chris. Jill gets the rocket launcher that can be loaded up with fire, acid, or grenade rounds, and they make short work of pretty much every enemy in the game. And since ammo for this weapon is fairly common, you don't have to use it very sparingly. Chris gets a flamethrower towards the end of his scenario, and it's not very good. Apart from one boss encounter against the giant spider, it's frankly pretty useless. And if the worst thing happens and you actually run out of ammo for every weapon, you've always got the trusty knife to fall back on. This thing is genuinely awful if you've got no idea how to bait zombies. Honestly, it feels more like a joke weapon than anything resembling something with actual use. And again, it's hard to imagine anyone actually running out of ammo in this game, so it shouldn't be something you have to use very often, unless you're a guy or girl or non-binary pal that likes pain. Enemy types range from standard slow-moving zombies to undead dogs, and then we start getting a little weird with it, with giant spiders, which I won't show for the arachnophobes out there, plant monsters, giant murderous reptilian creatures, and then weird human-bug hybrids. There's a good amount of variety here, and each enemy requires a slightly different approach to take them out optimally, which I like a lot. For example, groups of zombies can be taken out with one well-placed shotgun shell as long as they're all grouped up together. Dogs are best fought with a handgun since it's quick firing and can be readied and reloaded quicker than a shotgun. And hunters, well, just bring a magnum and be ready to run because these things don't play around. Now, in the past, I have voiced my distaste for boss fights in survival horror games, but somehow I feel like Resident Evil handles them all pretty well. I think the important part is that none of them outstay their welcome. Sure, it's easy to die to a boss if you aren't prepared, but once you figure out what it's up to, most of these encounters last under a minute. You even get some bosses like Plant 42, which give you the option to mix some chemicals and create something that dramatically reduces its health. It's a cool extra solution to a problem that could be a lot harder to deal with if you were to just straight up fight it. Unfortunately, most other boss fights don't really have the same sort of solution that Plant 42 does. For the most part, you just gotta shoot them until they fall down. Now that's not necessarily a bad thing, and sometimes it's nice to have a straightforward fight like that. But boss fights are easily the weakest aspect of Resident Evil, especially since the game's tank controls make navigating certain encounters a pain. Which isn't me complaining about the controls before anyone jumps on me. I'm just saying, in this one instance, they don't hold up great sometimes. And I get the bosses are there to thin out your resources and bring some tension back to the core loop, but most of the fights are more annoying than fun. Tying everything together is the storyline, which has its positives and negatives. Resident Evil's story isn't the star of the show, but it does end up being greater than the sum of its parts. There are only a handful of cutscenes that deliver the brunt of the plot, with other contextual information relayed to you via notes and journal entries scattered throughout the game. With that said, there are plenty of little twists and turns to keep things tense. Spoilers for Resident Evil 1 incoming that you probably know already anyway. For most of the game, it's not exactly clear who the main villain is. Obviously, we all know who it is now, but since none of the other characters get a great deal of screen time outside of each scenario's sidekick character, there aren't many people you can point the finger at. So when the twist does happen, it's not like it's a shocking revelation or anything. But Albert Wesker being the main villain is hilarious due to how comically evil he is during his limited screen time in the game. He's not quite the devious antagonist that later games would present him as. Here he feels pretty goofy, and that's reinforced by the incredible delivery of some of his lines. While Resident Evil's core story is spread thin, the slow build up to uncovering the mystery of the Spencer Mansion is what keeps it really engaging. And depending on who you choose to play at the start, you'll get a slightly different set of plot points. Jill has Barry, whose allegiances are called into question a few times, and you even get some choices that revolve around whether you trust him or not, and some of those can result in his death. Chris is joined by Rebecca for his story, but honestly, she doesn't bring too much to the table, which is why I'm only mentioning her now. She mostly performs tasks that Jill can do in her playthrough, but Chris can't, like playing the piano to get the gold emblem, or mixing the chemicals for Plant 42's boss fight. You even get to control her for a brief part of the game where Chris gets poisoned by Yorn the giant snake and needs an antidote, but I unfortunately chose to outright ignore her for the majority of the game, which cuts her role almost entirely. And that was a choice I made completely on accident because the game isn't totally clear about what it means. Most of Resident Evil's narrative strength is found in the environment. Little scraps of paper written by the mansion's now undead occupants, research that describes the monsters you've been fighting, and all of this stuff is super engaging because of how paper thin the rest of the story is, I'd argue. And it's a strategy that most survival horror games implement to diegetically contextualize some of the game's events. Again, considering that Resident Evil was the first truly mainstream game to do a lot of this stuff, it all works surprisingly well, and each note builds on the game's storyline in really cool ways. Now, as a final note on the story, I have to talk about the endings. And the funniest thing about these endings is that none of them are technically canon. The real ending is that every member of the STARS Alpha team, including Rebecca, survives this whole ordeal. But this isn't an ending you can get, since Barry doesn't show up in Chris's playthrough, and Rebecca is nowhere to be seen in Jill's. You cannot get an ending that is reflective of where things go in the future. Hell, you can even get an ending where everyone but Jill or Chris dies at the end of the game. But this is obviously not a good outcome to the game either. We have never had a Resident Evil title that has had this much divergence in its endings ever again. And thank Rob Zombie himself that we never got another game whose ending is just decidedly not canon for some reason. Anyway, let's close this thing out. It's remarkable how strong Resident Evil is as a whole. I'm consistently impressed by the fact that Capcom managed to get so much right on the first try. This game essentially laid out a clean template that nearly every other survival horror game would take inspiration from in one way or the other for years to come. We're still using the lessons established in Resident Evil for all kinds of games today. This is one of those titles that I learned to love a little bit more every time I play through it. And it's something that every survival horror fan should probably play through at some point in their life. Hell, if your only experience of playing through the first game is via the remake, I would say you have to play this game at least once just to see how drastic some of the changes are. In fact, if you were to ask me right now which version of Resident Evil 1 I prefer, I would genuinely struggle to decide right now. But either way you slice it, it is clear to see why Resident Evil 1 is so influential, and it's still a blast to play through right now. And as far as legacies go, it's hard to top that. But somehow the sequel manages to do that and then some. But that's a story for another day. Maybe in a couple weeks. Probably in a couple months. Or whenever I get around to it.